At RTX, we believe no challenge is too great, no question too big, no answer out of reach. That's why we never stop striving. Our global team works across Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, and Raytheon to inspire, innovate, and drive progress for generations to come. Together, we push the boundaries of known science and find new ways to connect and protect our world. Visit rtx.com to learn more.
I'm Ben Watson, and welcome to Defense One Radio. David Nasaw is a historian, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, and author of The Last Million, about Europe's refugees after World War II, which The Economist called one of the 6 must-read books on the Second World War. His latest work is about American military veterans, entitled The Wounded Generation, Coming Home After World War II. David Nasaw, welcome to Defense One Radio.
Delighted to be here.
Very good. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us here. This new book of yours, The Wounded Generation, it almost reads to me like a badly needed addendum to the greatest generation mythology about our World War II veterans. It seems to be the culmination of many underappreciated struggles from this group of Americans, a group that struggled monumentally to adapt and form a new middle class in this country after a time of worldwide economic tumult. My first question to you, when did the lessons and takeaways that fill this book, when did they begin to accumulate to the point you said this needs its own book? I mean, you could have chosen almost any topic, and most of this generation is gone, including my own grandfather, who was a survivor of D-Day. But in my lifetime, he was essentially mute every day until the end of his life, which is about 10 years ago. So my question, why now with this history?
Two-part answer. One, when I wrote The Last Million about the refugees from World War II who remained for 2, 3, 4 years in displaced persons camps in Germany behind barbed wire, it became abundantly clear to me, and it should have been clear before that wars do not end with ceasefires, with armistices, with peace treaties. They certainly do not end for the men and women in uniform who fought that war, nor do they end for the civilians, like the displaced persons. So I had talked in that book about the American soldiers who remained behind after the war as part of the occupation army. But I wanted to dive deeper into the post-war experiences of the 16 million, more than 16 million men and women who served in uniform in World War II. So that's part one. Part two is very much like you and your grandfather. I wanted to know about my father's experience in World War II, and he never talked about it. I didn't ask enough questions because when I did, it was clear that this was a subject that was off limits. My father returned home from Eritrea, where he ran a military hospital. He was a lawyer, not a doctor, but he was sent abroad to Eritrea, to North Africa, then Eritrea, to run a hospital in its last days and then dismantle it as the American troops moved on from North Africa to Sicily and then mainland Italy. My father came home early from the war, and he came home with a 100% medical discharge for a heart condition. He also came home an alcoholic and addicted to cigarettes. He stopped drinking when my mother demanded that she couldn't live with him anymore, and he never drank another drop for the rest of his life. But there was something there. There was something there that, as close as my relationship with him was, that I couldn't get to. I couldn't get to. And the war came home with him. And the wounds, psychic and physical, came home with him. And he died at 61. So I guess somewhere I wanted to know more about my father's experience. I tried to get his military records, and I only got a partial response, some of the military records, I guess. So in order to understand my father's experience as a veteran, his homecoming, his post-war life, I had to dive deeper into the story of his generation.
Did you ever thank him for that promise that he made to your mom to not drink again? Or is this something you found out about kind of far too late?
It was, it's a remarkable story. We're veering a little off track here. But my father told my brother that when he came home from the war, he put a fifth of scotch, J&B he drank, which he, talked about as Jewish booze, J&B scotch. And he said he put it on his bedside table so he could begin drinking when he woke up in the morning. And he drank a fifth a day. When I was about 4 years old, I guess my brother was 2 years old, my mother dressed us up. And when my father woke up, he said to my mother, "Why are the boys dressed up?" And my mother said, "Because I'm leaving. I'm taking them with me. I'm going back to my mother's house in Cortland, New York." And my father said, "Well, what do you want?" And my mother said, "You've got to stop drinking." And he said, "Okay." And from that moment on, and this is part of the story of the veterans of the greatest generation, which was the wounded generation, their strength, their perseverance, their desire to overcome the obstacles and to move from war to peace, from soldier to civilian. He said to my mother, "Okay, I'll never drink again." And he didn't. He didn't. When the rest of the kids had grape juice at Passover ceremonies, and the adults had wine, my father had grape juice. He wouldn't have a rum cake. This was the strength that was there and that a lot of the veterans possessed.
It's remarkable to read about the damage that you were able to kind of document that related to really just alcoholism alone. And of course, I understood America had a different attitude towards cigarettes back then. And of course, as you point out, drinking. The way that we understand trauma and therapy, all these things are, of course, vastly different here 80 years later. And at one point you write, the returning veterans had accepted the possibility of death as a commonplace of war. I was in the Army for 5 years, 2007 to 2012. I went to Afghanistan for 1 year. There was a point where we were about to deploy to Iraq, and we had to, my small unit, had to put our uniforms on before we were going to prepare for this Iraq deployment, which eventually turned to Afghanistan. But we had to get together and take photos. I can't remember the precise phrasing that my sergeant used for these photos, but he described them basically as when you die photos. So not uncommon, but a dark way to kind of phrase it. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, yeah, right. I mean, we had enough of the videos of IEDs in Iraq. We knew that was a very real possibility. But I still knew that it was nothing like what my grandfather faced without the kind of 21st century body armor that I was used to. That dark mindset for these World War II troops and the reality going into the war, for many, it morphed into other darker things when they came back home. You get into the effects on family life, and you get into stuff about lobotomies, and I completely forgot about that. And then you get into stuff about the ice pick variation of a lobotomy. Yeah. And I was trying to feel my socket above my eye, thinking, how did they do this? It's so disturbing.
Yeah. Well, part of the different world is that we don't know how many. If we judge by veterans today, the best estimates the VA has is about 20% of the returning veterans suffer at one point or another after their return from PTSD symptoms. If we transport that, if we use that figure 20%, 20% of 16 million is, I'm not going to do the math right now. It's huge, a huge number of men. And some women returned with symptoms of PTSD. Today, in 2025, and for the past 30 years, the VA, the psychiatric profession, the general public understands what PTSD is. When the men and women came back from World War II with symptoms of PTSD, sleepless nights, nightmares, flashbacks, sudden rages, irritability, an inability to reconnect with friends, family, wives, children. They were told by the VA doctors, the military doctors, they were told that you're suffering from combat fatigue. It'll go away. Just give it time. Well, it didn't go away for these guys. It didn't go away. And those who suffered the most and went to seek help in the VA hospitals and were admitted, as I talk about in my book, nobody knew quite what to do with them. Those who were given some sort of talk therapy were asked about their childhoods, because the sense was that the trauma that they brought home with them from war was not due to the war itself, but was underlying from their childhood, which had been re-triggered in war. There was no understanding of what war can do, nor was there any understanding of what we now know as TBIs, as concussions, as brain injuries. I mean, the sense was in 1945 that if there was no visible wound on your head, you'd get over it.
Yeah. Right.
Well, you didn't get over it. And the wounded generation, I use these adjectives back and forth. The wounded generation, which was also the greatest generation, these guys had to cure themselves. They had to cure themselves. And they did. And it took extraordinary willpower for them. They learned first by getting drunk how to deal with the discomfort, the anxieties, the ever-present nightmare that they were pawns in a game they didn't understand and they were going to be injured or killed. The ever-present survivor's guilt that they had come home. Why? They dealt with it by refusing to talk about the war, refusing to bring up the subject, refusing to look at war movies, refusing to read about the war, locking themselves inside on July 4th so they didn't hear fireworks going off, learning to sleep somehow and to control their nightmares so they didn't wake up the entire house, and throwing themselves into first school on the GI Bill and then work. What I found so disturbing in my research was that these men who had suffered from PTSD for 2, 3, 4 years on homecoming, and then learned to live with it. As they reached their 70s and their 80s, retired from work, sometimes lost their spouse to old age and death, the nightmares came back. And the VA was flooded with older veterans. And the VA clinics had to be established for older veterans who, in their 70s and their 80s, understood that what was coming back to haunt them was PTSD. Fortunately, there was now treatment, and the VA recognized that these men needed treatment and provided it for them.
Well, on top of this poorly understood PTSD situation right out of World War II, there were fears of bringing the war home that animated a significant portion of the country. You write that much of the worst post-war violence here in the States was directed at Black Americans, especially in the South, Black veterans in particular in many instances. We've discussed the story of Isaac Woodard in previous podcasts, but his experience was hardly an isolated incident. Some episodes you describe are pretty, truly horrific in their detail. Is there anything that even you were surprised by as a seasoned historian going through this particular chapter of the post-World War II experience in America?
Yeah, I think what I was most disturbed by was the preemptive preparation for the return of Black veterans all through the South in 1943, 1944, 1945. Elected officials, police forces, citizens groups got themselves ready because they knew that having worn the uniform of their nation, put themselves in harm's way, lived among people for whom white supremacy and Jim Crow were not the norm, the Black soldiers and sailors were going to come home demanding the rights of citizenship that they had been deprived of. So in 43, 44, 45, preparations were made. And when the veterans returned, and a lot of them would later be Medgar Evers, M.Z. Moore, a lot of the heroes of the civil rights movement a decade later, when they were returned, they were met with immediate violence. They tried to register to vote in 45, 46, and were pushed back. They tried to sit in the front of the bus and were met with violence. And the stories, the Hosea Williams stories, later a lieutenant of Martin Luther King. I mean, these stories are just absolutely blood-curdling. A lot of the Black veterans, all of the veterans, when they came home, recognized that the only clothes that fit them and fit them poorly were their uniforms, because they had been away for 3 years and they no longer fitted to their old clothes. So they went out and tried to buy new clothes. The poorer you were, the longer you had to stay in uniform. And a lot of the Black soldiers in the South had to remain in uniform. And that was considered a direct affront to whites, that these Black guys wore their uniforms walking down the street or riding a bus. And that was a surefire invitation to violence. So yeah, I was just amazed at this. But more than that, I learned, look, the GI Bill was one of the greatest pieces of legislation Congress has written and presidents have signed. But the GI Bill, in order to get the white Southern votes that were needed for its passage, was written in such a way so that local authorities exercised a great deal of power over who was going to get money and who wasn't. The GI Bill was written that, you got free tuition, but you had to be admitted to a college to get that free tuition. And in the South, the state universities and colleges were segregated by law. And the historically black colleges were already overcrowded. So black veterans were disproportionately able to use their GI benefits for education. Even more damaging was their inability to use GI mortgage guarantees, because what the GI Bill did was it guaranteed a mortgage, but you had to get approval from a bank and a mortgage from a bank before you could get the guarantee. If you were a black veteran and you lived in the South, no bank was going to give you a mortgage. Therefore, you wouldn't be able to buy that first house as my father did, using a mortgage guarantee. So the violence, the physical violence of the immediate homecoming was exacerbated by an economic violence, an economic prejudice that was built into the GI Bill. And I didn't know about that when I began my research.
Your section on Hollywood, novels, and plays was for me a useful reminder about themes from later movies like Taxi Driver and Rambo, and the durability of the damaged veteran trope.
What a historian has to do is recognize, the first thing you learn is that the past is a foreign country and we can visit it, but we've got to learn the language, we got to learn everything else. So in order to do the research on this book, I went back and I looked at the movies that Americans saw in 1945, 46, 47, 48. I read the Saturday Evening Post and Look and Life and Newsweek and Time. I looked at all the women's magazines, read the newspapers, and what I discovered was extraordinarily different from what I had expected. The veterans were received with elation that the war had been won, that they had won the war, and that so many returned home looking normal, with no visible wounds. But what I hadn't expected was the fear and trembling with which they were welcomed, because the fears of a depression were omnipresent in 1946. These guys came home, and the fear was, and it was a real fear, that without jobs, without homes, because there was a terrible housing crisis, without promises for the future, they were going to act out like the veterans, the German veterans of World War I and the Italian veterans of World War II. I mean, the Italian veterans of World War I. The German and Italian veterans were the foundation of what would become Nazism and fascism. So the public was afraid. And when you watch these movies, I mean, Blue Dahlia with Alan Ladd, and Bogart movies, Dead Reckoning and Key Largo and In a Lonely Place, and Robert Ryan in Crossfire, and Robert Montgomery in Ride the Pink Horse, and there are so many more. You see the angry, vicious, violent veteran, often with a good heart, but unable to control himself. I think the best document about World War II is, The Best Years of Our Lives. What a great movie. Great movie. And Dana Andrews, who's in a lot of these movies, I don't know if you remember it. There's a scene in which he returns, he gets his job as a soda jerk in a department store. Somebody insults him and he ends up slugging the guy, That's what everybody was afraid of.
Hmm.
And those movies are great, just great. And they tell the story that we've forgotten about the dark side of homecoming.
Yeah, your list of movies makes me want to basically start a whole new podcast that just dives into those movies.
Well, it,
I hadn't known that there were so many of those adjustment to society stories.
well, in the short stories and the novels, there are so many of them that part of the story becomes, I mean, there are films and short stories about the innocent veteran who everybody assumes is a killer, and everybody assumes is a killer, and he has to prove his innocence. And then there are the stories about, there's the Bogart movie, In a Lonely Place, is based on a novel. In the novel, the Bogart character comes back and becomes a serial killer as a veteran. In the movie, they couldn't quite do that. So they make Bogart this violent, scary character, but he's not a killer. In a bunch of other movies, in Crossfire with Robert Ryan, you know, um, Robert Ryan is a killer. He's so angry. It's based on a novel called The Brick Foxhole, and he's so angry that he kills, a gentle Jewish veteran for no reason whatsoever. So the violence is there, and it's stark and it's dark, and it reveals part of what I've called the dark side of homecoming. J. Edgar Hoover warned that the veterans were dangerous. In Los Angeles, the chief of police warned that the veterans were bringing home souvenirs. Veterans from Europe were bringing home German rifles,
Sword.
and the veterans from the Pacific were bringing home swords. And that was entirely legal, but the Los Angeles police chief warned families and the public to watch out and make sure those souvenirs are put away in a safe place and that they're not used by the veterans.
Well, I still watch this particular topic, of course, with us being on the future of national security, and mass shootings are part of American security. I think you pointed out folks were ready to jump on any connection to a veteran in an instance of violence, and yet that still endures today, because I think it was last weekend, we had two mass shootings, one in Michigan and one in South Carolina, I believe, and both were by Marine veterans, about aged 40. I think both of them were. And so I still, am very aware of this. This is discussions I had with soldiers whenever I was deployed and afterward about this wounded veteran image, trope, cliche. But the durability of it is quite remarkable. My last question to you: how has the process of researching and writing this book changed or informed your grasp on what you might call progress? For example, toward like a more equal or equitable society in America, trying to be better, be a better nation by the time you finished writing this book?
One of the things that I learned and was the GI Bill provided the broadest, most generous social welfare program that any nation provided for its veterans, any nation at any time. And I think we should be proud as a nation of what we've done for our veterans. The VA is by no means a perfect institution, nor are VA hospitals perfect. But we have created a series of institutions, and we have accepted our responsibility to the veterans. And instead of entirely dismantling the GI Bill provisions, we've expanded them and extended them. And what I hope and pray is that future generations of veterans are able to get the same assistance that the GI Bill provided the World War II veterans and that subsequent federal assistance has provided for the veterans through the 21st century. I hope that it remains that way, and I hope that if some administration tries to cut back on the veterans' benefits, there will be a outcry, east, west, north, and south, that forces Washington to pay, to fulfill its responsibility to those who have fought for us.
David Nasaw is a historian whose latest book is entitled The Wounded Generation, Coming Home After World War II. David, thanks again so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Well, that's it for us this episode. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
At RTX, we believe no challenge is too great, no question too big, no answer out of reach. That's why we never stop striving. Our global team works across Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, and Raytheon to inspire, innovate, and drive progress for generations to come. Together, we push the boundaries of known science and find new ways to connect and protect our world. Visit rtx.com to learn more.